What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so before I get into this video, I want to give a big shout out to the brother Brendan Bellamy for the donation to the channel via the PayPal. Much respect to you for showing love to Too Raw for TV. All right, so I want to talk about. I know you guys get tired of me referencing this. I get it. But I want to talk about this fake GOAT debate between LeBron Ramon James and Michael Jordan. And one of the arguments that the opposition love to make is that LeBron Ramon James made his teammates better while Michael Jordan did not. They talk about how, despite the fact that LeBron Ramon James played with inferior talent, alongside him, he was able to take them to 10 NBA Finals, while Michael Jeffrey Jordan played with the likes of the superstar Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant. And they were able to win without him easily in 93, 94, and 94, 95. That's the erroneous and grossly absurd argument that they like to make. When in reality, LeBron Ramon James played with multiple All-Stars and superstars and Hall of Famers, including Chris Bosh and Dwayne Wade. And these players always had to adjust to the system, a system that often illuminated his statistical output, while they had to adjust to the system, never him having to adjust to playing with them. If you didn't fit into the system, you were jettisoned off the team, and you had to augment and alter your game to fit to playing with him, often at a detriment to your stats and perhaps even your trade value. One particular player, Kevin Love, had to see a psychiatrist while playing under the spotlight. Michael Jordan overall played with only really two Hall of Famers, Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman, at least in their primes. And the thing that's different about Michael Jordan as opposed to the other guy is that Michael Jordan introduced a winning culture in Chicago. And he helped to make Scottie Pippen better. Whereas, unlike what the revisionists love to tell you, Dwayne Wade showed LeBron Ramon James how to win. Because before he went to Miami, LeBron Ramon James put up stats, and for the first 46 minutes of a game, he was magnificent. But it was the crunch time, when going up against superior teams, is when he faltered. And he ran from Cleveland to collude with other stars to build a fake legacy. Before Michael Jordan was drafted in 1984, the Chicago Bulls were a joke. In 83, 84, they only went 27 and 55 to half-filled arenas. And the Chicago Bulls were doing worse in attendance than, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus attractions that came to Chicago Stadium. They were horrible. In comes Michael Jordan. And in a league that at the time only usually saw significant transformative figures as far as players altering and franchise for the better, like Wilt Chamberlain, like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, like Bill Russell, like Bill Walton. Even Larry Bird was a big man, really, 6'9". Usually it was bigs that did that. Michael Jordan elevated the team. Yes, they only won 38 games, but that's 11-game improvement over the year before. In 85, 86, had he not suffered that devastating foot injury that robbed him of 64 games that season, the Bulls probably would have won 45 games or more. Remember, a hobbled Jordan went 9-9 that year, which may not sound that impressive until you compare it to the fact that the Bulls only went 21 and 43 without him. Then a healthy Michael Jordan torched the '86 Celtics, one of the greatest teams of all time, for nearly 44 points per game in a 3-game series. Nearly beat the mighty Celtics himself in Game 2. But he didn't have the talent around him that was necessary to compete in the NBA. For a fan base that always cries that their savior never has enough help, they seem to hold Michael Jordan to a higher standard. He had to win without any help, or they hold it against him, which means to me that they really do believe that he's the GOAT. They just don't want to admit it. As great as he was, he needed some help. And that came in raw talent and Scottie Pippen, a draft day trade in '87, and Horace Grant, who I think came from Clemson University, if I'm not mistaken. Scottie Pippen, Central Arkansas. City, I think, called Hamburg, Arkansas. Scottie Pippen, I strongly believe to this day, had he not been drafted, traded in draft day from Seattle to Chicago, I think he would have been just a somewhat better version of Stacey Augmon. I think Scottie Pippen was elevated by playing against Michael Jordan, playing with Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan helped to make Scottie Pippen what he was. He maximized Scottie Pippen's potential, as with Horace Grant. But more importantly, he helped to change the culture of Chicago to a winning culture. So much so that even in his absence in '93 and '94, that 17-game span where he was not on the court, Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, and B.J. Armstrong, the remaining nuclei from those championship teams, plus the brilliance of Phil Jackson, was enough to keep the Chicago Bulls winning. They knew how to close out games, to the point where if you look at the '93-'94 season, they went 55-27, but hell, I wouldn't be surprised if like a dozen of those victories came probably within a 5 points or margin or less in close games. Remember, the '94 Bulls had a completely different roster from '93, which doesn't get put into the equation from the Lenitwitz. Gone was John Paxson. Gone was Trent Tucker. Gone was JoJo English. Gone was all these other guys from the '93 team. In comes Steve Kerr. In comes Luke Longley. In comes, I think, Bill Winnington that year. It might have been '95. I forget. But a lot of guys that would come and play in the mid to late '90s dynasty teams were coming aboard that year. And also Tony Kukoc, the Croatian sensation. People forget about that. Scottie Pippen in his prime, Horace Grant in his prime, B.J. Armstrong in his prime. The toughness was there. That was not apparent before they played with Michael Jordan. So while he wasn't on the court, they didn't have his talent offensively on the floor. But they did it enough by committee to eke out many close games. And they acquired Pete Myers, who was a pretty good defensive standout, so that at least on one side of the floor, the defensive side, Phil Jackson was able to replicate and in some ways even exceed overall on the defensive side what the '93 team could do. So while they only averaged 96 points per game that year, as opposed to the 103 the year before, their defense statistically got even better. And when you really look at the '93-'94 team, if you really look at it, it's kind of the '96 team without Michael Jordan. And it makes sense because if you take Michael Jordan out of the '96 team, don't they probably still win 50 games? So in essence, if you put Michael Jordan in his prime in '94, that team wins 75 games. Makes sense. It also makes perfect sense that when Horace Grant left in free agency and joined the Orlando Magic, when a healthy prime Horace Grant joined that team, they went all the way to the NBA Finals. Don't think that his leadership didn't have something to do with it too. Yes, Penny Hardaway's talent, Shaquille O'Neal's dominance had a lot to do with it. Dennis Scott being one of the first stretch, I don't even want to call him stretch, but one of the first prolific 3-point shooters. All of that had to do. The Nick Anderson before the free throw debacle was a dog. That had a lot to do with it too. The Horace Grant's leadership had a lot to do with it too. It's no mistake that Horace Grant being injured in '96 in the East Coast Finals hurt the team to the point they were swept. Although I think they would have lost anyway, even with him. I still could see them pushed into 6 games if Horace Grant had been on that floor. So that gets forgotten. Part of Michael Jordan's legacy was that he changed the culture of Chicago to the point where the players that played under him that were able to emulate his greatness, were able to get a look at how his approach to the game was almost pathological, but he was able to instill these winning tangibles to Scottie and Horace and BJ and the other role players and the guys that came into the Chicago Bulls organization. They knew it was up. The ante was up. Expectations were up. So the Bulls were able to continue winning. They just weren't able to be champions without the great Michael Jordan. But the culture had changed. So much so that they were still able to be one of the top franchises in the NBA. When Michael Jordan returned, he wasn't the same player he was before at that time. But that was the missing ingredient. That and the fact they needed a front court player, which they got in Dennis Rodman, and the rest was history. On paper, the Bulls were still, the 96, 97, 98 Bulls, they were still never the most talented team in the league. The 98 Lakers had 4 All-Stars. On paper, the Orlando Magic in 96 were more talented. On paper, the 97 Miami Heat were more talented, including their bench. But it was Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman. These guys knew how to win. They knew how to win. They knew how to close out games. And it's interesting that once these players totally left the scene after 98, the Chicago Bulls went off the cliff. That's no accident. In closing, let's go to LeBron James. Miami, after he left, were able to go to 2 NBA Finals. The Cleveland Cavaliers are the best team in basketball. Doesn't seem like they went off a cliff to me. Chicago, with the exception of Derrick Rose, haven't been anywhere near finals since then. Nowhere near. And we're coming up, over 25 years since that iconic shot? So, yeah, the next time someone talks about the 55 games and all that, they don't know what they're talking about. Part of it was the Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, B.J. Armstrong were all in their primes. Phil Jackson, a masterful coach, masterful strategist, the best coaching staff in basketball at that point. The nucleus of the 96 Bulls were there. It wasn't the same team from 92, 93. And Michael Jordan changed the culture of Chicago. But anyway, that's all I got to say about it. Tell me what you guys think.